It's bath time at the Baby Fold in the summer of 1938. I'm Bill Hammett, reviewing some of our old movies, taken the year before Gwen and I went to the Baby Fold on November 15th, 1939 as directors. Bill is helping in putting these old pictures together, while I am making these comments to try to recall some of the early days that we had in connection with this work. The Booth Festival, which was held here on the front lawn, will be commented on later as we get into a later one. The main reason that we wanted to include these pictures is to show Mrs. Asher, who was the second superintendent of the Baby Fold, and will show up here in a minute, a tall lady in a gray dress, gray hair, talking to one of the men in the group. Another superintendent, who was our immediate predecessor, Mrs. Newcomer, was the director of the Baby Fold from 37 to 39. She appears here in a figured blouse and turned the work over to us at the time that we came here in the fall of 39. You'll notice also the old buildings that were on the grounds at this time and which have been completely replaced in the intervening years. I think you would be interested in noting, too, that our budget in 1940 called for $24,040, and of that amount, $1,600 came from what was then the community chest. This family group room is of the oldest children that we had under care at that time, because our age range then was from birth to 6. And these were the oldest children that we had. As a child reached his 6th birthday, other plans had to be made for him. He would go either back to his own family or into a boarding home or to some other child care facility. The children were cared for in small groups of 5 or 6, with a group mother looking after them all of their waking hours except the time that they would be in play or in a kindergarten program. At the time we came to the Baby Fold, there were 8 students, 7 group mothers, 3 practical nurses, 2 laundry people, a housekeeper, and a cook. We had no maintenance man, no secretary, no bookkeeper, no nurse, no caseworker, and a very skeleton, untrained staff. The best educated person we had in our group had but a high school education, and there were only a few who had even this much. One woman who worked in the nursery and the laundry was blind, and 3 others we had to commit to mental institutions in the year following our arrival. These children were celebrating their first Christmas after we had been on the scene. You can see something of the family rooms that we had, and of the clothing and the equipment that we had at that particular time. I want to call attention to Marion Crane in this picture, and I'll speak of her later. This is Dr. Wettall, who is our dentist, and Dr. Abbott shows up here in a minute too, who is our eye, ear, nose, and throat specialist. These doctors all donated their services to care for our children and made regular trips to the Baby Fold on a scheduled basis to supervise their physical needs. This particular group of children was heading out for Sunday school when these pictures were taken, and they went over to our church where they took part in the regular Sunday school activities. You'll notice the awnings on the buildings here that had been put on in the first year that we had been here. This is the junior homecoming queen in the ISU homecoming parade. Sherry was a little 5-year-old sweetheart who has done quite well in life. I'll refer to her again a little later on in this story. The students decorated the house for homecoming, and they had a sign up under the eave, "We babies welcome you too." These young people enjoyed being a part of their school's activities as well as being volunteer workers who were working with us in exchange for their room and board. We have heard from many of these students over the years, and some of them have cherished the memories that they've had working with us. This young lady was from Virginia, Illinois, and she had fallen and sprained an ankle and was having difficulty getting around, and she thought I was trying to take a picture of her limping, which couldn't be avoided under the circumstances. The house to the immediate right there, the Far East house, was a residence for the staff, and as we come across to the west buildings, they were the ones that were housing the children. The third floor of the west building was used for student help, but this building here on the east side had no children in it at all except our own when they came along, and it was usually pretty well filled with staff people. The hedge, which you'll notice out across the front in some of these pictures, was given to us by the Onarga Nursery, and we hauled it over in our car, and the WPA at that time put it out. So the hedge that we have out in front of the Baby Fool property today is older than most of the people who are working here. This front yard picture was taken after we had done some cleaning up and some painting and had put out a few shrubs. You'll notice as we move along here that a quarantine shows up briefly in one of these pictures, which dates it. You don't see a quarantine anymore, but in those days, contagion of any kind required the public health officials to mark it that way. This again is a picture, a full view of the residence where we lived and where most of the staff people lived. The salaries were so low that maintenance was a principal factor in keeping help, and where they had room and board and were not out for transportation, they could get by on the $21 a month that most of them received. Our living quarters were also in this building. Our bedroom was upstairs and our living quarters on the downstairs part of the building. The backyard was very large and spacious. This old barn had to come down. There was no need for it. It had been put together with wooden pegs originally. But when the Baby Fool moved up here in 1910, this was out in the country, and it was not even a part of the incorporated town of Normal. We had no cars, so there was no need for this barn as a garage. The institution never owned an automobile at that time. Miss Harris shows up here in a minute, who was a deaconess on our staff for 32 years. And in that period of time, which was her adult lifetime, she took care of more than 1,600 different children. There were a lot of young people who came back in the years remembering Mother Harris and the affection that she had given to them and wanted to make inquiry about her. These old buildings are very obviously a fire trap. This new garage was put up later when we had some staff people who had cars and who needed a place to keep them. And this connecting corridor was built across from the residence building to the building where the children lived in order that the staff might get back and forth in bad weather without being out in the storm and in the cold. We painted some of these buildings, repaired them as best we could as we went along with the money that we had available to make these improvements. You'll notice out here on the playground that outside toilet back there, which is made out of lattice work. The first inside toilet for the children, bathing facilities for the children, was put in our first year. This was required by the health department at the time that they were threatening to close the institution if some improvements were not made to provide for the physical needs of the children. Amy Harvey shows up here in a minute as our kindergarten teacher for some of these years. She had worked under Miss Tucker at the university and out at the children's school, and donated her services in exchange for living quarters to help provide training for our children. She did much to help the family mothers understand the children and to work with them individually instead of just herding them as a group. You'll also notice in these pictures the two black children that are in the kindergarten group. Chucky and Gertie were among our most popular children, and we want it noted for the record that the Baby Fold never discriminated in its acceptance of children or in its services in any way. It didn't take the civil rights reforms of the 1960s to make these changes at the Baby Fold. They were part of our program from the very beginning, and of course it is difficult for me to understand how any church program could be operated on any other basis. Miss Stein was one of the practical nurses on our staff, and one of the carryovers from the previous administration. The play equipment is very primitive, as you can see, but it was the best that we could afford at that time. Our student boys repaired these various items as they could and would paint and fix them up so that the children did have something to play with. You'll notice the old tires that are shown in many of these pictures, because long after all the mileage had been gotten out of them as far as cars were concerned, they had a lot of additional mileage in them as playthings on the play yard. The sandbox was also one of the favorite spots, and Marcy here has seen the maintenance man dig with a shovel, so he's trying his best to do the same thing. The children would have milk and snacks in the middle of the morning, the middle of the afternoon, and these picnic tables which the students had made were ideal for this purpose. Miss Hochberg was our head nurse, coming on our staff in January of 1940 and remaining with us for the ensuing 27 years. Here again is our little junior queen with a friend of hers playing dress-up, creative play which all children love. The last picture we had of Sherry, or the last letter that we had from her father, said that since he had been moved to Washington, D.C. as an attorney for the National Labor Relations Board, that she was the regular Sunday afternoon strolling partner of Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes. We just wonder sometimes if the other homecoming queen at ISU fared so well. These pictures of the old dorm are rather scary, and but they really portray the raw conditions which we found. These old beds, many of them had not been painted for years. They had no mattresses. Some of them had old mattresses, but most of them were